about 600 in Byzantium, all which was established shortly after this, 1650, in the Caliphate of Islamic civilization, all which was established at least by 600 or 700 BC in Cynic civilization. That is to say, I forget now what my line of thought would be here. A kind of monarchy, which I will give you now as a paradigm. It's called providential monarchy. And it is associated with the idea of a providential deity. To us today, who shove religion off into a corner somewhere and insist that religion mustn't have anything to do with communities or certainly nothing to do with politics or business or many, many other things, it is hard perhaps to grasp that one of the most potent things in establishing the structure of the state in any civilization has always been men's ideas of the nature of deity. And I will not give you my paradigm for that. I will simply point out to you something which must be obvious to you. The deity, God, has many different attributes. He's creator, he's masculine, he's up, he's transcendental, that is, he's outside of the world, space, and time, that was established by 500 BC. Eventually, he's one. That's what Muhammad insisted on. God is one. And then, that he is omnipotent, all-powerful. Now, I stop at this point. Providential empires never got further than this. Now, the next thing that's developed in our ideas of deities in Western civilization were that God is good. That was established by the prophets from the desert, certainly by the 5th century BC. And then came the Christian message that God is love. And then came the scholastic inference that God is pure reason by the year 1250 AD. Now, what you believe to be the nature of God in many civilizations, including our own, has helped to determine the structure of the society. And the crucial one I want to point out here is this. By 500 BC, in Western Asia, it was pretty well established that God is omnipotent. He can do anything. And there is nothing he cannot do. Thus, he is pure will. And at almost the same time came the other idea, which you find in Job, that God is good. But if God is good, he cannot do anything. He can only do things that are good. And if he can only do things that are good and cannot do things that are evil, then there is something higher than God. The rule of ethics. Thus, the great contribution, even before Christ, moving toward the Western idea of deity, was the idea of transcendental ethical monotheism, to which Christ added that God is love. And so forth. And it always has sense. Now, if God is one, and God is all-powerful, and he can do anything, and he is providential, which means he interferes in the world, then whatever happens in the world is because he permitted it. And whatever he permitted, who the hell is any ordinary human being to question it? Now, if you read Job, you'll see that this begins to come into that contradiction, that conversation, where Job is saying, God, you're running the world all wrong. You're letting bad people be elected president and so forth. You have to avoid it. Now, this is providential monarchy. Let me read what I wrote here about it. In providential monarchy, deity is, and it's Asiatic, heaven. The Chinese word is yin, which means heaven. The idea in the original Indo-European was something like deus. Deus, from which Deus came, and from which Zeus, which is Zeus, came, and so forth. It meant bright, brilliant sky. That was the deity. And this was a being of willful and arbitrary omnipotence. And if there is a ruler on earth, that ruler was picked by the deity. This means you must accept whatever happens. It leads, of course, as you can see, to fatalism, even though they don't accept that in their actions frequently. And the ruler is the vicar of omnipotent will on earth. Now, this has a number of things. There is no rule of law. There is a rule of God's will. This is the heresy of the West. When the Crusades went to capture Jerusalem, and their war cry was, God rules it, they should have been rejected. This is not Western. Because the Western idea is that God gives man free will. And if he does evil things, he's responsible. And so forth. A totally different kind of thing. In the West, you get accordingly the rule of law. In providential monarchy, you do not get. You get the rule of will. And the slogan very quickly became, one God in heaven, one ruler on earth. Which meant that providential monarchs consistently tried to conquer the world. And these are the great world conquerors, and I've already said Genghis Khan was the greatest of them. And very much we're studying his government, his army, his whole attitude. It's a magnificent machine for world conquest and world rule as the vicar of heaven on earth. There are no constitutional rules of political succession in a providential monarchy. There are no constitutional rules of succession in Islamic civilization, in Byzantine civilization, or in Russian civilization, ever. And to talk about constitutional law in Russia is talk nonsense. Even right up to the end, there was no constitutional rule of succession. Alexander I left a note in his desk saying that he wanted his second or third son, I forget which one it was, his second son, I believe, to be his successor. And that was an act of will, not an act of constitutional law. And this is the day, of course, in Russia today. Notice it's true in China. It always was true in China. China was a providential monarchy. But in the West, where we have the rule of law, where even God is under rules, the rules of ethics, you have a totally different situation, and you expect to have constitutional rules of political action, including the rules of political succession. Now, the Carolingian Empire, whose date it was built up in the course of 200 years approximately, let's say 687 to 887 approximately, 200 years, was an attempt to impose in the West a providential monarchy which was a heresy, not in terms of the West's beliefs at the time, but in terms of the belief which were intrinsic in the nature of Western thought, including our belief in Christ. And in both of the Testaments. And while everyone that I read is full of praise about Charlemagne, Charlemagne was that kind of a willful man trying to do something that was impossible to do, which was to conquer practically the whole world. And he failed. The reason he failed was that he was doing it in a period of constantly deepening economic depression. And as a result of constant deepening economic depression, it became less and less possible even to conquer all the provinces of his own empire, and totally impossible to rule the provinces of his own empire. Because as the depression became worse and worse and worse, transportation broke down, all bridges collapsed. I've read some magnificent accounts of somebody trying to go from Chartres to Paris. I described this in about half an hour, I guess. I don't know, went through traffic. And it took them something like 11 days. When they got there, the horse died of exhaustion. And they had to do such things as trying to patch holes in bridges by taking the shield so the horse would fall through and so forth. All right, all commerce disappeared. Everybody was reduced to living off of the piece of land they were on, and this became the communities which are the root organizational patterns of the West. The local communities, call it the parish, the village, or the manor, whatever you want. It's local, it is self-sufficient. And one of the chief reasons that you could not, and Charlemagne could not, conquer great distance was it became economically impossible to capture any fortified building. Because you couldn't stay there long enough, you couldn't take enough men and enough food there to starve out the people inside, because anybody inside would have more food on hand than you could carry. And if you carried a very small amount of food, then you had to take a small number of men. In that case, they'd come out and chase you away. So, we got then, after Charlemagne, and the last Carolingian is 887, he was removed for not fighting the Vikings sufficiently vigorously. And for 100 years, there was no ruler. Instead, the whole society, and we call this a dark age. There is nothing wrong with a dark age. Dark ages are in many cases the most productive period in the history of any civilization. And certainly in Western civilization they were. Any of you have read Lynn White's book on the technological advances of dark ages, such as the plow and so forth, and harnessing, and so forth and so forth, know that we got a great deal. But out of the dark age that followed the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, we got the most magnificent thing which we have in our society. The recognition that people can have a society without having a state. In other words, the recognition that people can have have a society without having a state. In other words, it's wiped away by experience the assumption that is found all through classical antiquity except by unorthodox and heretical thinkers, that the state and the society are identical, and that a state such as the imperium must be a society. Therefore, you can desire nothing more than to be a citizen. And if you want to go down in a ghetto or catacomb and be with your cozy co-believers and so forth, then you are an enemy, because you're violating the fundamental assumption. Now, again, to get to the structure after this document. The Mediterranean has become a barrier. In the north, much neglected in our history books, but of vital importance, the Vikings were pouring outward. Before 750, they were pouring outward. Raiders, slaves, pirates, men of violence and virility. And as you know, they occupied Iceland and they settled in Greenland and Newfoundland and so forth. And they went eastward into Russia and started the beginnings of Russian civilization. Now I call this Northern Monarchy. It started as individual groups of pirate raiders, but it ended up, and that would be from 750 or so to 930. Then there was a brief lull. From 980 for 1,000 years to about 1080, they were coming out as monarchies. That is organized state structure. We call this Northern Monarchy. I invented the title and have certain definite ideas. Where those ideas came from, I do not know, and it hasn't been discussed. It's possible that they got some of them from Byzantium, because the Vikings went across Russia all the way to the Black Sea and Byzantine. It's possible that they got it from the Carolingians, something namely the Carolingians. But notice the extraordinary thing about the Vikings, I can't spend too much time on it, that they went so far that they surrounded Europe. That is to say, the Vikings didn't just go to Newfoundland and places like that. They conquered Normandy in 911. They had conquered England several times, most recently in 1066. They had gone down and conquered southern Italy and Sicily. They had gone into Russia, and it opened up the trade across Russia from the north down to the south. They had even attacked Constantinople and eventually had become the highest mercenary. And the extraordinary thing is this: in the battle in 1018 in southern Italy, Normans of Viking descent fighting on the side of the coast were in battle with so-called Varangians of Viking descent fighting in behalf of the Byzantine Empire. So there they had gone all the way around and were fighting. That Northern Monarchy is of very great significance, and it has things which seem very precocious. For example, it raised a military force, and it raised taxes on the basis of assessment on plots of land, which in England we call hives, but they have different names, they're found in Russia too. They had standing armies. Archaeologists recently, that is to say in the last 25 years, have found 3 large camps in Denmark, built about the year 1000 by the king Sven Forkbeard, where his standing army was ready at any moment to embark in the ship and go off. The success of the Vikings, like the success of the raiders of the steppes of Asia, was in mobility. But when the steppes of Asia mobility was based on horseback riding with an excellent weapon, the composite bow, the threat of the Vikings was their mobility on water, and they also had missile weapons. But by the year 1000, in Western Europe, you had a two-class society: peasants who produced food, and then a small percent of fighters who fought on horseback with sharp weapons. And who, if they, that is, were spear, and who, if they were lucky, had a fortified house in which to live. That's all they needed. So you have a two-class society. Now, eventually, that two-class society began to develop. And when we come to the year 1150, we find that a new class has appeared as a separate class, the clergy. I won't say how this happened. So what you have is a monarch at the top. You have the nobility who have weapons. You have the clergy. And you have the peasants at the bottom. But as I say, by the middle of the 12th century, you also have the beginnings of commerce, the rise of towns, the appearance of the middle class of commercial traders. So you have commercial traders. What the king did at the top was build up a bureaucracy. That is, a group of people who could write, keep records, to handle cases of justice in his court, to keep track of the money he could raise in his treasury, and he built up these. Now there's the king, there is the feudal lords, Carroll, there are the clergy, there are the bourgeoisie, the middle class, and there are the peasants who are out of it. All through this, they're out of it. They never have played any major political role. At first, the king used the clergy to gradually take away from the lords, the fighting men, powers that would make him stronger and stronger to build up a bureaucracy by doing it. But soon you discover you can't trust the clergy. They are frequently much too loyal to the bishop or even to the pope. By that time, according to the king, built up his bureaucracy out of the bourgeoisie. He took the sons of middle-class, town-dwelling, commercial people who could read and write and count, and put them in his bureaucracy. And this meant that you had the king and the bureaucracy recruiting and to some extent obtaining financial support from the bureaucracy, from the bourgeoisie. And it meant that the feudal lords and at least the upper clergy tended to come together and to cooperate in resistance to this. A 100 years after the last Carolingian died in 887, a microscopic lord near Paris was permitted by the 7 or 8 great lords who surrounded him, much more powerful than he was, to take the royal title. His name was Hugh Capet. The date is 987. Hugh Capet was the first of the Capetian kings, and he was allowed to take that title because he was so weak. They would not have permitted him any strength. In fact, the title of king, he was also allowed to take the title of suzerain, which means he was the top man in the feudal system. I will not attempt to define the feudal system if you don't know. So here the suzerain is combined with the king in a man who has no power, and who was young because he was pious and religious and weak. Now, as suzerain, he didn't have the powers of a real suzerain. A suzerain is simply a feudal lord that has no feudal lord above him. Because the feudal lords below him, who were technically his vassals, did not perform military service, did not come to his court to settle disputes, and had very little to do with it. But nevertheless, the power of his religious aura allowed him gradually to accumulate more and more and more power. Now, I want to say a few words about the title of king. King is a religious title. It means a ruler who has been consecrated with holy oils by an archbishop in an archiepiscopal cathedral. It's a ceremony very similar to the sacrament of confirmation. You're anointed with holy oil, and you thus become a kind of a special thing. This power of king allowed him to assume certain things, such as the king should see that everyone gets justice. The king should see that everyone gets protection. The king's peace, in other words. He will seek justice on earth with God's blessing. To the vassals, that meant that the Capetians should provide ethical and moral support for their individual political rights, which to them was exactly what they wanted. The interesting thing is that in 1792, when Louis XVI was going to the scaffold in the French Revolution, he still believed this, that the obligation that he had as a king was to support the rights of everyone, including the nobles and the church. So it was a powerful feeling. This was the central core of the old regime, and it cannot be emphasized too much. The king is the source of justice. Now, with this, I want to combine something else which is difficult, perhaps. The idea of property. In classical antiquity, we sum up in the word proprietas. It means possessing all the innumerable and unnumerable rights in an object, maybe with a few specific restraints. In other words, you have a car that will drive 150 miles an hour, but you're not supposed to drive 150 miles an hour. But it's your car. And you can drive it not with other people drive, you can rent it, you can sell it. In other words, that's proprietas. Proprietas is the sum of innumerable and undesignated rights in an object. This was not the medieval idea of property. The medieval idea of property was specific rights. And the word that we use is dominion, D-O-M-I-N-I-A, which is plural, meaning rights. Now, the obligation of the Capetian king was to preserve everyone's dominion. This meant that if there is an object, a piece of land, and a dozen people have certain rights on it, his job is to preserve their rights. And this includes, since he's under the law, his own property. Because it isn't his, it's the monarchy's, it's the family's. This means he cannot alienate his own property. It isn't his own. He cannot alienate the domain, we call it, the property of the monarchy. He gradually was assuming the dimly remembered powers that monarchy had had in the past, to coin money, to call out the whole people for military service in an emergency, to see that all men lived in peace and had justice, to grant municipalities rights of self-government, or to recognize specifically their rights of self-government, to protect the church and religion, to regulate commerce, particularly exports, so that there would be no shortage of food for the people. That's 6 things which were incumbent upon him as king. The last 4 of these are what in French public law is known as la police, the policy. That is, administrative power to use discretion in an emergency or a complicated social situation. Now, building up these, one of the greatest assets which the Capetians had was that for 8 generations they produced sons. From 987 to 1328, they produced sons. And in 1328, when they didn't produce sons, there were brothers. In fact, it first started in 1814. There were several brothers, and the brothers had sons. The much more powerful feudal lords which surrounded the Capetian Duke of France originally did not have so much luck. For one thing, they took a lot of risks. They went off to the Crusades and things like that. And as their families died out and they had no heirs, a right that existed to the king as sovereign was exercised. This is the right of escheat, that if a territory, a group of dominion, has no heirs, it comes back to the king, who can give it out to someone else. In this way, the kings were able gradually, and it took them till 1493, to get the territorial unity of France. But in getting the territorial unity of France, they didn't get the power in those territories. They simply replaced the existing lords, and because they were king, because they were under the obligation to preserve everyone's dominia, they were even less powerful when they became Duke of Normandy, Count of Flanders, Count of Anjou, Duke of Burgundy, or any of these other titles that were gradually accumulating. They were less powerful in those appanage, we call them, those territories, than the rulers that they were replacing, who were not under the obligation to be that law-abiding and that subject to the rules of what is right. There grew up then gradually a legalized confusion of extremely limited sovereignty. Because any act that a person did which was profitable or advantageous to him, if he did it long enough, he acquired a right to do it. We have in English law, this is called the right of prescription. But in English law, the right of prescription does not run against the state. In other words, if you do something and you do it for 30 years, you may have the right to do it against a private person who has private property. But you do not have such a right against the state. You may notice that every few years, and Rockefeller Center in New York is roped off and you're not allowed to walk between the buildings. This is to break your prescriptive right to walk across between the buildings. 1338 to 1453. And in this, the king obtained royal taxation a royal army, and a royal system of justice. We got something which is typical of the West, the rule of lawyers and judges. And there were three periods in the history of the West in which we have been overwhelmed by lawyers and judges who tell us again and again that you cannot do certain things because of the illegal, even if these things are absolutely essential to be done. That would be from 1350 to about 1480 or so, such a period. Again, from about 1690 through the French Revolution, 1789, was a revolt against this mass of legalistic couldn't do it. And in our own day, where judges and lawyers are running everything, and we are obsessed by it. But it's part of the tradition of the West, and it goes back, and the French Revolution is, of course, the violent response to that situation. Now, after about 1370, let me much more briefly. The English attempt to conquer France was hopeless. They could win battles, but they could not control territory. Eventually, all they did was go out and plunder, kill people, burn villages, seize rich people, pay ransom, and so forth and so forth, living off the country, and they believed that if they punish the French people in this way, the French people would realize the King of France could not protect them, and therefore they should turn their allegiance of England and recognize the King of France. Say this, because what the French people up had been thinking was that the local laws should protect them. And when he was unable to protect them, instead of shifting their allegiance to the King of England, they shifted their allegiance from the local laws to the King of France. This reached its peak in such things as Joan of Arc, 1429, who summoned the whole religious loyalty and allegiance of France to a very considerable degree to focus it on this pious weakling, I suppose in many ways, the tyrant man, the so-called Dauphin. And she insisted that he must go over to Rheims and be coronated. And she insisted that if everybody rallied, they would throw out the English. Well, the English were thrown out in about 25 years. That king, Charles VII, I think is one of the most important French kings, although this is not widely recognized. 2 years ago, a new biography of him appeared in English, and it is almost worth it. By a lady named O.D.A.L.A. Notice he was king, technically I suppose, from 1422 to 1461, and the war ended in 1453, although they didn't have a peace treaty until 1492, I believe it was. So he had a number of years after the war ended, in which he was king. And what he did, he tried to solidify the dominion of France in the way that they should be kept, because that was the custom, and that was the right of everyone. To do this, he did a number of things. He established a royal army with a systematic system of taxation to support it. But two other things much more important. In the pragmatic sanction of wars, 1438, he codified the rights of the church in France, and these were the rights of the church in France against the king, as well as against the Pope. And as Parliament church, electing its own members, its own bishops, controlling its own property, and so forth. That's 1438, but the war was still going on. And then in 1457, 4 years after the war, he issued, and this is amazing, he issued an edict, Montil Latour, N-O-N-T-I-L-L-E-T-U-R. I don't find the nation in most history books. It certainly is the most important edict, probably, that was in the old regime. It was an order for every locality to write down the local customs. It took 150 years to do it, and then it was revised. But by 1580, which is where we're starting, there were 365 law codes of the local customs in France, and these were the binding laws, which meant he had condemned France to what we would call legal disunity. So although he had territorial unity, he had every other kind of legal disunity. Taxes were different everywhere because the way it was customary to do it. There were tolls preventing farmers from moving everywhere. There was no unity of the judicial system. At one time there were 14 Supreme Courts. And this disunified condition was the condition which led inevitably to the French Revolution. Although it took hundreds of years to reach that inevitable status. Never look at the simple. No modern state in 1789 could survive which had different systems of weights and measures for every commodity in every village practically, or in every district, which had different laws, so as Voltaire said, you change law every time you change your folklore, which had conflicting jurisdictions, which had different rates of pay, so that rich paid nothing in taxes and poor paid a great deal, and other places rich paid a great deal. I mean, it was just chaos, because whatever was custom, and under the prescriptive right, that custom was dominion, and dominion was the law. And as a result, in 1789, we find a solution to a problem which, when I was younger than even the students who were here, struck me right in the face. I always had the eye of a child. I said, if the King of France is absolute, in 1789, all the books say it was, how could he be bankrupt? Unless the country was bankrupt. And no one claims that France was bankrupt in 1789. France was among the wealthy countries of Europe. So if the king is absolute, there's no reason why he couldn't use absolute power to raise the money that he needs from a wealthy economic system such as existed in France. This is one of the reasons I studied this subject, and what I found was that the king of France was not absolute, he was not even sovereign, and indeed, he had reached perhaps the peak of his power around 1520, and by 1576, when we're ending this lecture, already his power was collapsing. And it collapsing into a growing morass of increasingly rigid restraint. I'll give you one example, and then you can leave a little bit. The king could not follow because he had no collateral. If everything he has belongs to the monarch and doesn't belong to him, then he cannot put up any of these royal possessions as collateral on loan. He says, I'd like to borrow 100,000 livres, and someone says, well, what can you put up? Well, if you could get a necklace or something from the Queen that wasn't part of the royal dominion, that might be all right. But he had to borrow millions. So he had no credit. What he did was, for centuries, he couldn't alienate property, so he alienated incomes. And by 1789, every income that he had coming in had already been committed to some expense, so that his ancestors had said to someone, I want you to do this, and if you do this, you will take this income from this place. And in many cases, about traffic. So when he wanted to borrow money, he could say, all right, just give me money. He would say, I'll never pay it back, but I will pay you the interest on it. And you get the interest from this income, which has just come free, because the family has been getting it for 300 years has died out, and now this income is free. It yields, let us say, 100,000 a year, and at 10% interest, you will give me $1 million. And then you'll have 100,000 a year. And if you ever want your money, you can always sell an income of 100,000 a year to anybody for $1 million. Now, he had to find in 1561 enormous sums of money. I won't explain how he got so badly yet. They can. And what he did was, the city of Paris said that they would do it. They would guarantee these loans that were given to him, but they needed to guarantee the interest would be paid. And the Church of France volunteered to pay the interest. These are called they won't do the deal to pay. This made, within 100 years, 150 years, the Church of France stronger and more sovereign political entity than the monarchy itself. But we'll have to say that the next Wednesday. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Would like to thank Professor Quigley for his lecture. His reference to the Northern Monarchy and the Danes reminds me that we have a very distinguished guest in our audience from Denmark, Professor Erling Buell, who is visiting the United States on a bicentennial lecture tour for Denmark. And his visit is timed to coincide with the 175th anniversary of continuous diplomatic relations between Denmark and the United States, which is the longest unbroken continuous record of diplomatic relations of any country with which the United States has had diplomatic relations. Professor Buell, could you rise and be recognized? Professor Buell is here not only as our guest, but as a student of Professor Quigley's himself. He, too, is an historian and a professor of international relations and has written a book somewhat reminiscent of Professor Quigley's own, The World Since 1945. Also, I'm very pleased that Professor Quigley made some reference to providential deity, because Dorothy Brown on the way over here mentioned that some years ago she had seen a poster in the Walsh Building that read, "Jesus loves you." And beneath it, a student had written, "If that is so, why did Professor Quigley give me an F?" I hope that student was here this evening to learn that there is no logical inconsistency between Jesus' love and a Quigley F. I hope you will return and join us next Wednesday, same location, same time, same Professor Quigley.